In 1915, a Tillamook County writer named Samuel Cotton sat down to compile a small book of local recollections, one he titled Stories of Nehalem. Buried inside it, tucked between weather notes and pioneer anecdotes, was an account strange enough that researchers would spend more than a century trying to verify it. An older beach resident told Cotton that decades earlier, breaking open a heavy block of what everyone on that stretch of Oregon coast simply called the wax, they had been struck by a smell that made no sense at all. Not tallow, not pine resin, cinnamon. And pressed into the surface of the block, half worn away by sand and salt water, was a mark, not a scratch, not a natural blemish. A symbol, carved with intention, the same shape turning up on block after block, scattered across miles of beach that had never, as far as anyone could tell, seen a ship go down. What was a cinnamon-scented substance doing on a temperate Pacific shoreline where cinnamon has never grown? Why would someone press a symbol into a block of wax before it ever touched the sea? How much of this material was actually buried in that sand? And if this was cargo, whose cargo was it? And where had it actually been going? To understand why those questions still don't have a clean answer, we have to start with what 19th century settlers on the Oregon coast expected to find on that beach, and what they kept finding instead. By the time Euro-American settlers arrived on Nehalem Spit in meaningful numbers, the Nehalem-Tillamook and neighboring Clatsop people had already been collecting the wax for generations, trading pieces of it well before any documented sighting of a wreck. Fur trader Alexander Henry recorded local accounts of the material in 1813. Settlers assumed, reasonably enough, that they were looking at the aftermath of some ordinary shipping loss, a single crate or barrel that had drifted ashore. What the volume actually suggested was something else entirely. Diggers pulled blocks of wax out of the sand for decade after decade, and the supply never appeared to run out. Estimates from the research that followed put the total quantity of beeswax originally aboard the vessel somewhere between 5 and 20 tons, an amount so large that some 19th century observers refused to believe it could be cargo at all, and instead proposed it was a natural seep of petroleum wax rising out of the ground. Few people on that coastline in the 1800s had any reason to think about the Manila galleon trade, a Spanish shipping route that had by then quietly operated for roughly 250 years, carrying silk, porcelain, spices and wax from the Philippines to the port of Acapulco, on ships among the largest wooden vessels built anywhere in the world at the time. Most of that trade's known shipwrecks lay far to the west, scattered across the waters of the Pacific closer to Asia. Nobody expected a piece of that network to wash up on the northern Oregon coast, and for decades nobody seriously considered it. That explanation did not survive contact with the evidence. The blocks carried wicks. Some still had the shapes of candles pressed into them. Some, remarkably, still contained the preserved bodies of the bees that had produced the wax in the first place, and those carved marks were not random. They matched a known practice among Spanish colonial shippers, symbols used to identify a cargo's owner or point of origin before it was loaded onto a vessel bound across an ocean. As the volume of physical evidence grew, so did its geographic reach. Alongside the wax, beachcombers recovered shards of blue and white porcelain, fine enough that later analysis would trace it to Chinese kilns operating during a specific decades-long window under the Kangxi Emperor. They found teak ships timbers, a wood that does not grow anywhere on the Oregon coast, driven into the sand at the base of a nearby mountain. They found a small silver holy oil jar, the kind carried for shipboard religious rites, and in one of the more unsettling finds, researchers eventually confirmed that part of the cargo had included liquid mercury, sealed in ceramic containers, a substance with no domestic use on that coastline and every use in the silver refining economy of Spain's colonies in the Americas. Each new detail made the puzzle larger rather than smaller. This was not driftwood from a fishing boat. This was the wreckage of a large ocean-crossing vessel carrying luxury trade goods from one side of the Pacific that had gone down somewhere off a stretch of coastline where, as far as any European record showed, nothing that large should ever have been sailing. And for everything that has surfaced, far more has not. Silk does not survive 3 centuries in salt water. Ship's guns, iron fittings, and the rest of the hull itself have never been recovered at all. What beachcombers and researchers have actually held in their hands is a narrow slice of a much larger cargo, wax and porcelain being simply the fraction durable enough to outlast the centuries. Whatever else that ship was carrying when it went down is, as far as anyone can say today, still missing. The mercury alone raised the stakes considerably. It was not a decorative cargo, but a critical industrial commodity in Spain's American colonies, used to extract silver from low-grade ore, a process that underwrote much of the empire's wealth. A ship carrying sealed containers of it was tied directly into the financial machinery of a global empire, and its loss would have registered, however quietly, somewhere in that empire's own records. The breakthrough came slowly, and it came from combining several independent lines of evidence rather than any single dramatic find. Researchers working with the modern beeswax wreck project cross-referenced radiocarbon dates from the wax itself with the manufacturing window of the recovered porcelain, and both pointed to the same narrow span of years, the final decades of the 17th century. From there, they turned to the meticulous shipping records kept by the Spanish crown for its Manila galleon trade, the 250-year commercial route that carried Asian luxury goods from the Philippines to the port of Acapulco in New Spain. Spanish administrators tracked every galleon that sailed that route, and every galleon that failed to arrive. Cross-referencing the dates, the cargo type, and the last known departure records, researchers narrowed the candidates to a single vessel, the Santo Cristo de Burgos, which left Manila in the summer of 1693, loaded with silk, porcelain, mercury, and wax, and was never seen again by Spanish authorities. A galleon built in the Philippines, sailing under the Spanish crown, financed by New World Silver, had apparently ended its final voyage not in Mexico but on a beach in what is now Oregon, roughly 9,000 miles from where it was supposed to unload. Naming the ship, though, was never the same thing as finding it. Identifying a vessel from scattered cargo washed ashore is one kind of problem. Locating the hull itself, somewhere along miles of shifting, storm-battered coastline, after more than 300 years of sand movement, is an entirely different one, and it remains unsolved. This identification emerged across more than 2 decades of patient, largely volunteer-driven research, coordinated through what became known as the Beeswax Wreck Project. Porcelain fragments were analyzed against dated Chinese kiln production records. Wax samples underwent radiocarbon testing to narrow the range to specific decades. Only when those independent scientific results were laid alongside the Spanish crown's own centuries-old shipping ledgers did a single candidate emerge that fit every constraint at once. For that half of the story, the shipping manifest could only take researchers so far. The manifest could tell them what left Manila. They could not tell them what happened after the ship went down, or whether anyone aboard survived to reach the shore. For that part of the account, the answer came not from an archive in Spain, but from the people who had lived on that coastline the entire time. Long before any Euro-American writer set foot in the region, the Nehalem-Tillamook and Clatsop peoples had an oral tradition describing the wrecking of a large foreign vessel, a tradition passed down through generations and eventually recorded by a settler named Vaughn sometime in the 1850s. According to the account Vaughn documented, a ship carrying strange cargo broke apart offshore, its wreckage and wax scattering along the spit, and at least some of the people aboard survived long enough to reach land and live among the Nehalem-Tillamook. Vaughn, who knew a Tillamook leader named Kilchis personally, recorded that Kilchis himself spoke of ancestry tracing back to one of those survivors. Vaughn's account was not the only one collected. Around the turn of the 20th century, a settler named Thomas Rogers separately recorded recollections from other long-time residents of the coast, describing the same wreck, details that lined up with Vaughn's much earlier account, despite having been gathered independently and decades apart. Multiple witnesses, questioned separately across a span of roughly 50 years, kept describing the same ship, the same cargo, and the same stretch of beach. What none of these accounts can settle, even taken together, is how many people actually survived, what became of them beyond a single claimed lineage, or how their arrival was understood by the community that took them in. That part of the story exists only as fragments of memory, and it may never exist as anything more than that. What makes this account remarkable is not simply that it describes a wreck nobody had otherwise recorded. It is that specific details inside it, preserved independently through oral transmission for generations before they were ever written down, align precisely with what the archaeological and archival record would later confirm on its own: a large vessel, foreign cargo, wax scattered widely along the beach, and a ship whose crew did not simply vanish. The oral tradition and the shipping manifest, developed through two entirely separate methods of preserving the past, describe the same event from opposite sides of an ocean. Who were the people who reached that shore? What happened to the rest of the ship, the hull, the guns, the cargo that never washed up at all? Why did it take more than 3 centuries and a small library's worth of Spanish colonial shipping records to even name the vessel? How does a tradition passed by word of mouth, generation after generation, preserve details specific enough to eventually be confirmed by porcelain glaze analysis and radiocarbon dating? And how much of what went down with that ship is still sitting under the sand today? There is a second layer to this account, one that sits carefully on the side of tradition rather than confirmed fact, and researchers have approached it with real caution. According to Nehalem-Tillamook and Clatsop oral history, the wrecking of the vessel was not a single sudden event. Some versions of the tradition describe a night when the water rose far higher than anyone could remember it rising before, scattering what remained of the ship and its cargo across a much wider stretch of the coastline than a simple wreck would explain. Geological analysis conducted independently of any oral account has identified a massive Cascadia earthquake and tsunami striking the Pacific Northwest coast in January of 1700, several years after the Santo Cristo de Burgos is believed to have gone down, an event large enough to disturb and redistribute wreckage that had already been resting on the seafloor. What makes that geological date worth pausing on is where else it shows up. On the other side of the Pacific Ocean, in coastal towns across Japan, local records from that same winter describe a tsunami striking the shoreline with no accompanying earthquake felt on Japanese soil at all, an event Japanese scholars would later come to call an orphan tsunami, because its cause appeared to have no local source. Officials in several Japanese communities logged flooded fields, damaged homes, and disrupted harbors on a night when the ground itself never shook, a detail that puzzled local record keepers at the time and remained unexplained for nearly 3 centuries afterward. Modern seismological reconstruction, cross-referencing tree ring dating of drowned coastal forests on the Oregon side with the timing of the Japanese flooding records, has tied that orphan tsunami directly to a massive rupture along the Cascadia subduction zone in January of 1700, thousands of miles away on the Oregon coast. A written record kept in Japan and an oral tradition kept among the Nehalem-Tillamook, developed with no contact between the two traditions whatsoever, and preserved through entirely different methods across 3 centuries, appear to be describing consequences of the very same night. None of this proves precisely how or when survivors reached shore, or how much of the ship's cargo the earthquake scattered versus how much had already drifted loose over the preceding years. Oral tradition, like any historical source, has to be weighed alongside the physical evidence rather than treated as a replacement for it. What can be said is that the tradition, the archaeology, and an independent seismological record from an entirely different country all appear to be converging on the same underlying picture: a vessel lost, its cargo scattered, and a coastline reshaped by forces far larger than a single storm. There is one more thread to this story, and it belongs more to local legend than to anything a research team has confirmed. For generations, residents near Neahkani Mountain, the headland rising just south of where the wreck is believed to have gone down, have spoken of markings carved into rock somewhere on its slopes, said to indicate where a portion of the ship's cargo was carried ashore and buried by survivors before they scattered inland. Some versions of the story go further, claiming one of the men involved in burying that cargo never left the mountain at all. Whether any of that reflects a real event or generations of accumulated folklore layered onto a genuine shipwreck is impossible to say with the evidence available today, and researchers have generally treated it as separate from the confirmed archaeological record. It remains, at best, an open thread rather than a lead, So return for a moment to that block of wax Samuel Cotton heard about in 1915. A cinnamon scent that should never have reached that coastline, a carved mark matching Spanish colonial shipping practice. A vessel identified after more than 3 centuries through the patient cross-referencing of radiocarbon dates, porcelain manufacture windows, and Spanish shipping archives. An oral tradition recorded generations before archaeologists confirmed any of it independently, describing survivors reaching the shore. And, sitting quietly underneath all of it, a shared date between an Oregon legend and a Japanese fishing record, describing the same night from opposite sides of the same ocean. Is all of that connected the way it appears to be? Very likely, yes, more so than most stories this channel covers, since the galleon's identity itself is now reasonably well supported by multiple independent lines of evidence, but important pieces remain unresolved. The exact resting place of the hull has still not been located, despite more than 2 decades of dedicated searching. What happened to the people who reached shore, how many survived, and how their descendants' lives unfolded afterward, is preserved only in fragments, filtered through more than a century of retelling before it was ever written down. Some interpretations here remain genuinely debated, and probably will be for as long as the search continues. Samuel Cotton recorded a strange detail in 1915 that he had no way of explaining. Warren Vaughn wrote down an oral account in the 1850s that took more than a century to be taken seriously as history rather than folklore. And somewhere off the Nehalem Spit, under sand that has shifted for more than 300 years, the rest of a Spanish galleon still waits to be found. The ship, according to the record Spain kept, simply never arrived. No storm report, no survivor's account reached Acapulco. Just an entry in a ledger, and then silence. The coast was not as forgetful. It kept releasing pieces of that cargo for centuries, wax rising out of the sand decade after decade, porcelain shards turning up in dune grass, until researchers finally had enough fragments scattered across archives on 2 continents to put a name to the ship that lost them. 2 silences on opposite sides of an ocean. One in a Spanish shipping office that simply stopped expecting a vessel to arrive. One on an Oregon beach that kept its secret for more than 300 years before anyone connected a cinnamon smell to a lost trade route. History does not often hand us a match this specific, a scent, a symbol, a date shared between 2 coastlines that never knew about each other, and still leave the hull itself unfound. But that is exactly where this story stands today. Every piece of wax that has ever washed up on that spit is, in its own way, a small act of memory, left by people who never knew they were leaving evidence for anyone. They were simply living through an ordinary day on an ordinary beach that happened to be sitting on top of an extraordinary story. Whether the remainder of the Santo Cristo de Burgos is still resting somewhere off that spit, or whether the sea and 3 centuries of shifting sand have already taken the rest of it beyond recovery, remains a question the Beeswax Wreck Project and the archaeologists working with them continue to pursue, and probably will for years to come. That is not a weakness in the story. It is the story. Thank you for watching. If documentaries like this one, built on physical evidence and coastal oral tradition held to the same standard, are the kind of history you want more of, consider subscribing. And before you go, I want to ask you directly, if a piece of that missing hull washed ashore tomorrow, carrying a mark nobody has catalogued yet, what do you think it would finally tell us about the people who survived that wreck and the coastline that kept their story for 300 years? I'll see you in the next documentary.